Chapter 2. Eyes closed, Antonio pretended to meditate. He sat in the multi-faith space designated for the contemplation of Dismamona employees and faked it as best he could. Hands in his lap, Antonio breathed down into his diaphragm, resisting the panic that tugged at him. Only a moment ago he'd tapped a crisis code into his eyeline, and as he sat waiting, head bowed, the small device scrubbed itself clean. Every cell in his body was yelling at him to run. He'd hacked the offshore negatives, the actual negatives. That the mythical coding really existed had been shocking enough. That he and his consociate had hacked into the Dismamona servers and stolen them was nothing short of legendary. Antonio knew only too well what the corporation's security would do to him, and all he wanted to do was bolt for the exit. But he didn't dare risk logging the device on his wrist, while his tactics and procedures remained vulnerable. So, palms slick with sweat, he waited for the alarms to go off in his earpiece. The rhythmic hiss of waves on a shale beach would mark the end of the scrub. Then he'd head straight to the car stack. He waited, and he breathed. Anybody watching Antonio may have noted his calm appearance. Silent and still in the vaulted space, he gave little indication of his fear. As a recusant agent, he'd gone undercover in circumstances more threatening than this. It certainly wasn't his first emergency extraction. Nevertheless, a flighty instinct in Antonio's chest urged him to run. It had fluttered there since he'd received the alert, but experience had taught him to resist such impulses and to follow protocol. Antonio inhaled through his nose as his mind raced onwards. There was no error, no chance he'd misinterpreted the alert. His cover was compromised. What the fuck had happened? He'd have to wait for the debrief. The inevitable question of betrayal nagged at him, but that was unlikely. In his experience, operation failure usually came down to human error, not malice. Sloppy work, loose ends overlooked, miscommunication, poor teamwork, weak leadership. Someone was in for a fucking scolding. That was for sure. This would never have happened if he'd been on the support team. It was at times like this he wondered why he'd ever left the safe confines of the support unit. Squirreled away somewhere behind a chain of proxy servers and encryption relays, why hadn't he resisted more when they'd pushed him out into the field? He guessed this was what happened when you made a name for yourself. Only had himself to blame. Antonio's reputation went way back. Before the private wars, even. Back to when he'd sold his security expertise to hacker groups and ripped inside information from high-profile organizations for monetary gain. Hackers had hired Antonio for his counterintelligence skills. His anti-forensic techniques were second to none and prevented detection, or at least hindered investigation, if the group's activities were discovered. He was the guy who had everyone's back, the virtual getaway driver who left no trace of the crime and no trail of crumbs to follow. But the private wars brought a complete paradigm shift, and cybercriminals were left with a peculiar conundrum. Hacking had always been a dangerous pursuit, But without the protection of nation-states, without someone to safeguard their basic human rights, it was open season. They had a choice to make. Join the corporations or oppose them. Simply picking their pockets was no longer an option. Antonio made his choice. The rebel group he joined, the recusancy, had pressured him to spend more time in the field, and now he had to rely on others to watch his back. Yes, someone was getting hauled over the coals by the balls for this one. He exhaled through his mouth. Anyone listening might have caught the slight tremor in his breath. One hand in the other, Antonio controlled his trembling and ran through the protocol once again. It had become a kind of internal mantra, looping in his mind, providing a familiar structure to contain him and stop his frayed nerves from unravelling too far. Car stack, medical centre, break clean. The doctor booths were on the 8th floor of the medical centre. Booth Orange 4 was prepped. He'd entered the crisis code into the auto doctor, and it'd give him a fresh identity and appearance. A melanin boost would shift his skin tone darker. His hair and goatee would be shaved and his scalp polished. There'd be new contact lenses with different iris colours and retinal imaging re-identification. False fingerprints would be fitted, and he'd pick up a pack of DNA gum to chew. He'd ditch his eyeline for a clean replacement, giving him access to a clean car, and, with a change of clothes, he should have enough cover to get out of the city. The recusancy would debrief Antonio and his consociate at the nearest safe house before they both went underground for a more substantial identity alteration. Soon there'd be another face staring back from the mirror. Antonio sighed at the prospect. Unfamiliar expressions made by unfamiliar muscle groups, strange aches in limbs that seemed wrong, a tad heavy, or too long. The voice in his mind so poorly synced with the one he heard in his ears. The resonance peculiar and distracting. Knocking his drinks over, banging into door frames, the disorientating circus of it. A sense of imminent danger stirred Antonio's adrenaline, interrupting his train of thought. He reassured himself. Get through the next few hours. Follow protocol, step by step. Keep breathing. The faint hush of breaking waves sounded in his ear, and his eyes pinged open. A glance around the multi-faith space confirmed he was alone. All the pews were empty. The thought of some clandestine figure lurking amongst the vaulted pillars at the back of the chamber was theatrical, farcical even. Still, as he sauntered past them, Antonio took a moment to glance over his shoulder.